Governance, we've been talking about it for a long time, but I think it's still very important as we are journeying towards becoming a developed Sri Lanka. If I just ask you, Dhananath, whether we can go back to the last 12 months, how has our stance on governance, good governance, evolved?
Governance is often, like the poor governance, bad governance is often a challenge in reforms. It could be economic reforms or it could be governance reforms. So in my view, for the last, with the crisis that we went through and with some sort of reforms that we brought in, especially on the central bank front and also on the public debt management front, that fixes the loopholes in most of the governance issues. But there's a long way to go. For an example, on the corruption, it's the procurement law that we have to brought in to minimize corruption. Without bringing the reforms, the structural reforms into it, if we just try to depend on honest people or only the people element, that would not be successful.
If we specify, like, how exactly should these reforms regarding SOEs look like?
I mean, with the crisis on network industries like CEB, Water Board, and also there were other corporate entities like the Hilton Hotels, the Litro Gas, a separate channel called SOE Restructuring Unit, and they were trying to attract investors and restructuring. However, even in the IMF Governance Diagnostic Report, what has been recommended was to bring all these state-owned enterprises under a one holding company. The role of the government is not doing business. The role of the government is actually good governance.
That's regulatory.
That regulatory framework, because their performance will be measured based on the governance. But I think the holding company at least is a good start. But we have to accelerate it and do it, because the more that we wait, the more burden that we add to the taxpayer. The challenge is while at the surface level it looks equitable, what happens is actually it makes inequitable, because for government to compete, they are again taking money from the taxpayer. Let's take Sri Lanka Railway. That is not even an SOE. It actually has to be an state-owned enterprise, but it is as a department, because railway department. When the government runs it, you can offer like a ticket at 20 rupees or 30 rupees or 40 rupees. Of course, if you allow it for a private operator, they cannot cover that cost. But at the same time, the railway has been running at a loss. I mean, they have been making about 500 billion for the last 10 years, if I am not mistaken. So that's quite a lot of money.
Yes. Could have been used elsewhere.
So that means that money has been either captured by the taxpayer or we have borrowed it at a treasury bill or a treasury bond rate.
Sri Lanka is journeying towards economic recovery and growth, which makes good governance crucial. We spoke about all of this and more with Dhananath Fernando. Stay tuned.
When you have an ambition, trust your instincts, move forward. This is your moment to shape your future, to be independent, to strengthen yourself. Your time is now. Accelerate your progress, empowering your progress for a fulfilled life. Union Assurance.
For 30 years, LMD has been the voice of business in Sri Lanka, capturing the pulse of the nation's corporate landscape through its iconic covers. Each cover tells a story, from the first edition in 1994 to the present day, narrating key moments, leaders and trends that have shaped Sri Lanka's business ecosystem. Over the years, LMD covers have featured thought leaders, business pioneers and game-changing innovations, reflecting the evolution of industries and the economy. As we celebrate 30 years, these covers represent more than just publications. They are a testament to LMD's legacy of excellence in business journalism and its unwavering commitment to being Sri Lanka's leading voice of business. LMD, Sri Lanka's voice of business, a legacy of 30 years.
Hello and welcome to LMDtv. We're focusing on good governance today. And I'm here with the CEO of Advocata Institute, Dhananath Fernando. Welcome to our show.
Thank you very much, Val.
Governance, we've been talking about it for a long time, but I think it's still very important as we are journeying towards becoming a developed Sri Lanka. If I just ask you, Dhananath, whether we can go back to the last 12 months, how has our stance on governance, good governance, evolved?
There's been important consensus that we have agreed with the IMF on the IMF governance diagnostic report. So there actually we are covering quite a lot on the governance structures, because governance is often like the poor governance, bad governance is often a challenge in reforms. It could be economic reforms or it could be governance reforms. So in my view, for the last with the crisis that we went through and with some sort of reforms that we brought in, especially on the central bank front and also on the public debt management front, that fixes the loopholes in most of the governance issues. But there's a long way to go. For an example, on the corruption, it's the procurement law that we have to brought in to avoid, to minimize corruption. So without minimizing the corruption, if we only, without bringing the reforms, the structural reforms into it, if we just try to depend on us people or only the people element, that would not be successful. So for the last 12 months, I think with coming from the crisis, over time, I think the reform structure that we have brought in is to an extent working, but it's important that we have the checks and balances and to make it a continuous drive to travel the distance which is ahead of us.
And keep this momentum going.
Absolutely.
And talking of reforms, we are always talking about the need for state-owned enterprises to be reformed. If we specify, like, how exactly should these reforms regarding SOEs look like?
So there was an attempt, with the crisis on network industries like CEB, water board. There was one approach taken, and also there were other corporate entities like the Hilton Hotels, the Litro Gas, a separate channel called SOE Restructuring Unit, and they were trying to attract investors and restructuring. However, even in the IMF governance diagnostic report, what has been recommended was to bring all these state-owned enterprises under a one holding company.
Okay.
That will minimize the ministerial oversight and the appointment process to the director boards, because now what happens is most of these SOAs are in each ministerial lineup. So the minister has the powers to appoint the board of directors and the the senior executives. So in that case, it's open for corruption and also political patronage. But what has been recommended was, okay, you have a holding company, and holding company has a director board, and that holding company is responsible for the governance structure of the entire SOEs. So I think the government is considering to move ahead in that direction. Of course, our recommendation has been there are certain institutes that there is no point that the government keeping it under them. So we have to privatize some of them. Some, okay, you can give it a try under a state-owned holding company. Some we probably have to merge, some we have to move for like a public-private partnership. And if the government is quite, interested on certain sectors, maybe we can consider even giving it. But overall stance is the role of the government is not doing business. The role of the government is actually good governance.
That's
That regulatory framework, because their performance will be measured based on the governance. There's enough private sector who can take the leadership and drive when it comes to the private sector operation or like the commercial operation. That has been our overall stance, but we understand there are political reasons, there are social reasons, there are historical reasons why it is been in the same way. But I think the holding company at least is a good start. But we have to accelerate it and do it, because the more that we wait, the more burden that we add to the taxpayer.
If I'm going to ask a devil's advocate kind of question, so like you said, the government has to be the regulator, not a competitor. Yet, is there benefits to be drawn if they are actually competing in terms of making it more equitable?
Yes, the challenge is while at the surface level it looks equitable, what happens is actually it makes inequitable, because for government to compete, they are again taking money from the taxpayer.
That's true.
So whoever who is contributing, that means you are making an unfair call on taxpayer. At the same time, sometimes it's also crowding out for entrepreneurs, like crowding out in the sense it discourages entrepreneurs. For an example, let's take Sri Lanka Railway. That is not even an SOE, it actually has to be an state owned enterprise, but it is as a department, because railway department. So there's a legal challenge there, but actually it's a commercial operation. Now, if you really look at it, there is enough private sectors. Even in the past, for the same Sri Lankan railway, there were some private operators in the sense that there were trains operated by the private sector. So by government trying to do it on their own, just thinking that okay, we can give like reasonable price, price tickets for the general public, while you have restricted an entrepreneur to enter the market and provide a better service. At the same time, we know the service quality has been drastically declining. So as a result, actually you're making it inequitable for the same general public who would, easily can get beneficial by traveling by train, because now at the moment because of the train services are poor, they have to buy a vehicle or a motorbike and then commute to Colombo. But actually if they had even at a higher price ticket, it would be still cheaper than traveling than their own vehicle, pumping fuel, and also adding to congestion, which has sort of environmental impact as well as monetary impact. So that's why I said, in a way, it at the surface level, it's all with good intention, because okay, when the government runs it, you can offer like a ticket at 20 rupees or 30 rupees or 40 rupees. Of course, if you allow it for a private operator, they cannot cover that cost. But at the same time, the railway has been running at a loss. They have been making about, I think about 500 billion for the last 10 years, if I am not mistaken. So that's quite a lot of money.
Yes.
Could
have been used elsewhere.
So that means that that money has been either captured by the taxpayer or we have borrowed it at a treasury bill or a treasury bond rate. And at the same time, you are having a very poor service for the passengers and the general public. So if you actually make it, the proper way could have been to make it equitable, you give the option. Of course, the government can keep a stake at it. Stake of the railway. They can maintain the railway, the rail line. They can charge the private sector for doing that and pay better salaries for the railway staff. So then things could have been, I think, much convenient at an overall economic point of view.
It's time now to take a very short break, but we'll soon be back to talk more about good governance.
Display your brand message on digital screens at prime locations. The largest digital advertising network in Sri Lanka. Emerging Media.
Welcome back to the show. We're in conversation with Dhananath Fernando, the CEO of Advocata Institute. And talking about like government playing the role that they should play, good governance and all that, how can the government ensure that they come up with a regulatory framework that is actually also not a barrier to the private sector? Because I don't know whether I can say that the government is doing their regulatory role to the optimal, but if they are, how can they ensure that it's not a barrier but actually an enabler?
Generally, in markets, what you say is you regulate only it is necessary.
Okay.
Otherwise, the regulatory framework takes itself by the demand and supply and by the competition.
The market forces.
Market forces has to work. But in certain industries, in certain cases, government has to have a regulatory framework. They should not over-regulate nor under regulate. So ideally, that's where the generally when it comes to regulation, there are a few things that we have to keep in mind. First is the regulatory capture, because if the industry is quite strong, they can always capture the regulatory authority. Secondly, to make sure the regulator is independent, you should have a financing mechanism to sustain the regulator's role. For an example, when you take Securities and Exchange Commission, there is a fee that the stock market operators are paying to get themselves regulated. So as a result, Securities and Exchange Commission is quite financially independent. So as a result, they need not to depend on the government, and as a result, they can function a proper regulatory mechanism. The same thing happened to PUCSL, because they were at one point depending pretty much on the government budget for the Public Utilities Commission. They are under Ministry of Finance, so it always depending on the public Ministry of Finance, because earlier. Now it's a little bit better. So what happened? So then, for political reasons, sometimes the government says, okay, you bring down the electricity prices and things like that. So as a result, it is not a proper functioning. Even let's look at the central bank. They are the main regulator of all financial institutes. Even in the central bank, even in the previous law, there was a clause that the government cannot have a cap on their budget, because the moment that they do it, the central bank functions will not be able to function. So one key factor is to have a financial independence on one side, and because at the same time, then they can recruit competent people who can regulate and measure it. Second thing is having that proper regulatory framework and getting the information from the industry. So then only they can actively regulate, because the information is available.
Updated also.
Absolutely, because now electricity, one challenge is, for an example, to getting the information from this. It's a pretty much a state monopoly. While the private sector can contribute, but they are basically the main buyer of electricity is the CEB. So even the information is not available on generation, on transmission and distribution. So that having that framework is also important. So we should not over-regulate, neither we should under-regulate, but also we have to give that independence to the regulator, mainly to depend on finances, independent finances, because then they can recruit competent people and they can be accountable for the public when they have that independence.
But that's quite a shift. How easy or difficult would it be to
It is, yes, it is challenging. On some other sectors, we are only introducing the regulators as we move on. I think the gambling industry is one sector. But overall, it is a challenge, and that's the role. That's what I say. The role of the government is think on that aspect rather than trying to do businesses. Because by trying to do businesses and trying to do regulation is difficult. It's like you're
contradicting, right?
Absolutely, it's contradicting. It's like you're playing the match, and also you're trying to be the umpire of the match, which doesn't make sense. So that's where the parliament has basically their role is. You have your institutional setup, you get the stakeholder consultancies, and then you actively draft this legislation which basically regulates whenever only necessary. You should not go and intervene in all markets and try to put regulations all over, because then there will be too many regulations which contradicts with each other and nothing can be functioned. But there are certain industries that you have to have a regulator, but it's ideal it has to be a very blanket, very simple regulation, but also very effective one.
Interesting. Then that's my next question to you. I was going through one of your previous addresses early on in the year, and you said something very interesting. You said that there's a need to include commitment to ethical economic governance and reconciliation to promote long-term economic planning. That sounds very challenging to do, but I know we would have had some kind of progress. Where do you stand on that statement today?
The reason is Sri Lanka, we had a 30-year unfortunate war. So the reconciliation is very important because in economic theory, there's called transfer of tacit knowledge. Tacit knowledge is where there are certain skills that you can only acquire by working with people. The best example that I could give is Lasit Malinga's bowling action. Regardless of how much that you follow him, that you try to copy him, it's only by playing with Lasit Malinga, getting him as a coach, you can get that tacit knowledge. This happens all over the world. For an example, if you work in Japan, there is a higher chance that you know 5S, that you can implement more productivity measures at your workplace. That means that tacit knowledge comes to you. So in Sri Lanka during that 30-year period and even after the crisis, a lot of people migrated. So it's important that we do the reconciliation, because one option is they are actually doing quite well in other countries.
Yes.
So they have capital. We can bring that in and develop our northern east area, which is quite a lot. I mean, quite there's ample land there, so it's easy to set up industries and do this. First, second is with not only capital, it's that tacit knowledge
Coming, yes.
coming in, because there are now few generations who are there and they are actually they are foreign citizens now, but they still have the heart in Sri Lanka, so you can attract them. And it's important because there is, peace is one critical factor for any economic development. When there are, when there are guns being fired, no one is coming and investing. So as a result, we need that reconciliation to move forward and integrate everyone to the economic activity. That's where we can develop Sri Lanka, and that's very critical and important. So that's why I said reconciliation is important, because of the unfortunate chapter that we had, and we have to basically attract everyone who is possible with capital, with knowledge, and also most of these people have network, and I'm sure there are a lot of Sri Lankans, you all know, doing quite well overseas.
Of course.
And so we can definitely depend on them, but we have to create that proper regulatory framework and the business environment to attract them.
Interesting. Nana, there's been such an interesting interview, but I'm aware of the time now. So I'm going to ask you my final question. Whilst we are setting up this business environment that's conducive for foreign investors who are Sri Lankan at heart, how challenging or easy would it be for the government to ensure good governance whilst also eradicating corruption, whilst also continuing this momentum towards economic growth?
For any government, it would be a big challenge. The reason is that when the system is not right, there are already winners and losers who is trying to protect the same system that they have been benefiting.
Yes.
So there are already inherited parties or stakeholders of vested interest who really do not want to change. So as a result, it would be very difficult. But I think the government has to have the courage, since they have a majority, super majority, and it's a golden opportunity for them to bring, not to focus on the individuals or the human element factor. I mean, you have to look at the human element factor, but they have to have the rules of the game defined properly on the industries. So then that rule system will take care of the system itself. That institutional structure is what is important. That requires quite a lot of technical know-how, knowledge on setting it up, and some legal background, and also that execution power. You need people, and of course that skill comes with also at a cost. So that's where we recommend that you can have a strong government, but a limited government, because by trying to expand it more and more, you are basically making yourself weaker and diluting it. Rather, what you need to do is you basically consolidate and make it a strong and an effective one. So then this technical expertise can be absorbed. At the same time, this gigantic task can be achieved
bit by bit,
by bringing or setting up the necessary institutional structure.
It's a lot of work to be done.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Dhananath.
Thank you very much, Monty.
We've been in conversation with the CEO of Advocata Institute, Dhananath Fernando. Thank you very much for being part of our show, and loved having you here.
Thank you very much.
And thank you to all our viewers for joining us. Until next time, take care.
Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram and X. Thank you for watching and stay safe.